Well, thank you very much for the kind offer of this talk, and I just might say that I have had the extraordinary experience of talking to another student conference just across the road at UCL, the Cruciform building, where I was once a houseman. These were lawyers, and I was talking about end-of-life issues. So what I'm going to talk about now in the next 20 minutes, so that we've got a bit of time afterwards for argument and discussion, is ethics. And the original title I gave wasn't approved by your organising committee, so I changed it. The conference, I gather, is Aspire to Inspire, so I said, well, how about accepting as a title, ethics as the inspiration of medicine? They said that would do, so so that's why you got this title. They also wanted me to say a bit about how I got to where I am, as it were, so I'll give you a little bit of biographical intro before getting stuck into a bit about the ethics. I was a very bad medical student, and I started at UCL here, and then I went to Oxford for my clinical, where I had a lovely time, but I didn't do very much work as a medical student, and indeed failed my finals, primarily I think because I hadn't done enough work. But one thing that I was a sportsman, and I acted, and I played my trumpet, and all that. I just didn't work very hard at medicine. But one thing I was interested there in was ethics already, because it seemed to be really quite interesting, the very different approaches to medical ethics that all these different consultants had. So when I qualified, finally qualified, I should say, I spent 6 months doing my resits, a couple of resits, and I spent time as a milkman in order to pay for the extra 6 months. And I had a very interesting experience as a milkman, because in the early morning I delivered milk to the hospital, at which in the afternoon I was a medical student. So I'd walk in there in my grey coat, carrying my trays of milk, and other people in grey coats, blue coats and so on. Morning, how are you? Horrible day, chat, chat. Other people in white coats, there weren't many of them around, but there were a few. You might say good morning to them. They'd totally ignore you, wouldn't see you, you were in a grey coat. Afternoon, I went in my little bum freezer white coat. Exactly the reverse happened. I'd say hello to somebody I'd talked to in the morning, perhaps, who was in a blue coat. They couldn't believe that I was talking to them. I was in a white coat. Whereas I was acknowledged, at any rate, the lowest of the low, but acknowledged as a medical student by people in white coat. So don't forget the importance of uniforms. Very, very important indicator of where you stand in the world. Anyway, when I qualified, I asked the professor of medicine if I could do a DPhil in medical ethics. And this was in the early 60s, and he looked at me like that and come to my office, and I spent half an hour being told off by this man in his office. And what it boiled down to was you can't study medical ethics. If you could study medical ethics, you could only study it if you were a very experienced doctor who knew what the hell he was talking about. And if by any remote chance a young doctor could study medical ethics, shouldn't be you, Gillon. So, this was admittedly, we weren't the best of friends ever since I told him that he shouldn't be buying South African sherry at the introductory sherry party. That was in the days of apartheid, and there was all this South African sherry. He said, you shouldn't be buying this stuff, sir, don't you know about the boycott? So we weren't the best of friends. There we are. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I don't want to go too much about the biography, I finally did a degree in philosophy because I was very interested in ethics, and I thought the degree in philosophy would help. I'm not sure that it did. It was a wonderful experience. I loved the philosophy. It added a strand to my life that continues of great interest. And incidentally, I was a very good student in philosophy, did extremely well in philosophy, unlike in medicine. But I didn't find that the ethics teaching was very useful. But then I was introduced to the first edition of Principles of Biomedical Ethics by Beecher and Childers, and was introduced to this notion that there are 4 prima facie principles that all of us, whatever our background, whatever our moral background, our religious background, our political background, we could all accept as prima facie these commitments, moral commitments to benefit others, not to harm others, beneficence, non-beneficence in the jargon, to respect other people's autonomy, briefly deliberated, thought out choices for themselves, autonomy, self-rule, not rule of others, and justice or fairness. Very difficult to give a thumbnail sketch of that, but I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. Anyway, the idea was that these 4 principles underlie your medical ethics commitments as a healthcare worker, doctors and other healthcare workers. Well, I knew all about Popper by then, and the great thing to do was to disprove hypotheses, and the stronger they were, the less you could disprove them. So I set about disproving the claim that anyone could accept these 4 prima facie principles. Prima facie is a very important concept, introduced by an Oxford philosopher in the 30s, and it means that these principles apply except where they conflict with each other, and then you have to decide which of the ones is the relevant one for the circumstances. And that's a very difficult question. That's where judgment comes in. I don't have an answer for you for judgment, but it does seem to be very useful to have these main principles, as it were, these main commitments to have in one's everyday practice. So that's the first warning. When they conflict, there's problems of judgment, and many different ways of trying to deal with judgment. I don't have a good way for that. We have to make our own decisions about how to choose between these conflicting principles. Among the useful aids to doing that are our professional obligations and the laws in our democratic societies. Now, the second health warning that I should give about these 4 principles is there's a big question about their scope. Who should they apply to? Or indeed, what should they apply to? For each of those principles. So, yes, I have an obligation to benefit others, but which others? Who? Fairly easy to answer for doctors that there's one group, at any rate, we know the answers. Who? Patients, thank you. That we all commit ourselves to helping our patients. Not only our patients, because there are areas of medicine where it's not patients that we're committed to help, public health being the obvious example, where we're out to benefit the health of populations rather than individual patients. And there may not be patients at all, trying to help them not get ill, for example. But anyway, the question of who it is that we have obligations to benefit is going to be a scope issue, as I call it. And we have to make decisions about that as well. And in that area of scope, let me add another good example that I see it as a problem for decision making, even if we accept these 4 principles, and that is the question of abortion, and indeed what to do with human embryos. Now, we all accept, whatever our moral background, that we ought to go around murdering each other. But what we don't agree about is what we mean by each other. And that's where the crucial issues about embryo research, dealing with embryos, abortion, what do they fall, these early human beings, within the scope of our moral obligations of these 4 principles? I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm just going to try and delineate for you the area of concern. And it applies not only to these specific issues, but also, for example, when it comes to the question of autonomy, respect for autonomy. Yes, we should respect each other's autonomy, but who are autonomous people? We all know that babies aren't autonomous because part of the concept of autonomy is the ability to deliberate, to think
rationally, reasonably about whatever the issue is. So you can't be an autonomous baby. I mean, unless you're in science fiction or something. They don't have the capacity to deliberate. And then the question is, as they do get older, well, when do they become sufficiently autonomous for their autonomy to be recognized and respected? And we have this in medicine, we have it in ordinary everyday life. You know, when does your child become sufficiently autonomous to be able to be allowed to make stupid decisions? Because you think they're stupid, but they think it's wonderful, and they're old enough now, you think, or developed enough, mature enough, to say, well, we must let them do their own thing. We can advise them, we can give them suggestions about what would be a better thing to do, but, you know, we'll respect their autonomy. On the other hand, in some areas, we won't respect their autonomy. These decisions are too dangerous, and even if they think they're good decisions, we're not going to, when we're their parents, we're not going to allow them to do it. Big tension between deciding this issue, where they're going to, you know, which side of this line are they? And the same in medicine. So pediatrics is the obvious example, very analogous. When are we to allow the children to make their own decisions about healthcare? But we get it in general practice, and we get it in mental health practice. When is mental disease of one sort or another sufficient to override this person's autonomy, not so that we don't accept their decisions, even though they might be thought out. They're not sufficiently autonomous to be acceptable as against their best interests. So, and then the question of justice, you know, well, it depends which sort of justice you're talking about, but to whom do we owe obligations of justice? And if we're talking about distributive justice, to whom are we going to give our scarce resources? Don't think that you are immune from this notion if you say, well, all the world, we have all obligation of justice to everyone in the world. Because then I'll say, well, what about the people in the future? Have you got obligations of justice to them as well? And if you say yes, you better reorganize your health system very radically, because if we're going to distribute our resources to all the people who need it, and indeed all the people in the future who might need it, it's going to be very little left for us here in our own population, wherever it is. Anyway, questions of scope, very important. Health warning about this. Usually there's a few skeptics who say, no, I went in for the money. Or the power, or whatever. But the vast majority of us go into medicine in order to benefit others. Then, of course, and that's right back there in, you know, in Hippocratic times, and in the Hippocratic Oath, and in the Hippocratic Corpus, that we're there to benefit our patients. And we're there to benefit our patients with as little harm as possible. So that's two of those principles, beneficence and non-maleficence. And that's been there a good 2,500 years. In more recent times, we've had two more principles, as it were, that we gradually, as doctors, come to recognize. The first of these is respect for autonomy. Now, I'm sure that doctors respected the autonomy of very rich and powerful people, even in Hippocratic times. But for the rest, you did what the doctor told you to do, the doctor's orders. And even when I was a medical student, doctor's orders was quite a normal notion. You know, well, the doctor tells you to do it, you have to do it, doctor's order. Maybe in some communities there's still the notion that if a doctor tells you to do it, you tell you how to do it. I mean, well, I won't ask the question, but you know what I mean. In some communities it is the case that doctors behave as though they are allowed to tell people what to do, and to give the orders, and in a lot of communities that's still accepted, that they have to do it. Well, increasingly, the notion that actually it's not just the rich and the powerful whose autonomy has to be respected, but also everybody else who has adequate autonomy, their autonomy should be respected as well. So that's an additional principle, I think, that we in medicine have come to accept. And the final one of these principles, which we're beginning to accept, is that Yes, we've got our special obligations to our particular patients, but we also have an obligation of fairness or justice, and that may sometimes temper our obligation to our particular patients. That we ought, at the very least, for example, not to waste resources that we have the use of, so that more people can have them. And of course, this notion of ever expanding spheres of justice, so that yes, we have our primary obligation to our patients, but what about patients in our group, in our area? What about patients in the whole country? What about patients abroad, in other countries, but who nonetheless need our help? So I would say those four principles are pretty widely acceptable, but what I always ask when my people who listen to me when I talk about this, I do talk about this quite a lot, think about which of those four principles you would reject in your own moral background, whatever it is. Whether it's religious or atheist, which particular religion, whether it's socialist or libertarian or whatever your political background is, which of those four principles do you, as a doctor, as a potential doctor, actually reject because it doesn't fit in with your moral perspective? And my guess is that you won't reject any of them. Now, there are some practical aspects of each of these principles that I think it's important for me to at least skim over. And this is only a skim, but if you want to have a fuller account, just Google two of my papers. One is a very ancient paper called Medical Ethics, 4 Principles and Scope. It's in the BMJ in 1994. It still has the basic claims, as it were, and the argument in favour. And you can download it just by Googling those two things, and my name, Gillon. And the second one is a paper in which I most recently defended this approach, which is last year in the Journal of Medical Ethics. And then I have to remember what it's called, if I can. What is it called? Anyway, it's something like in defense of 4 principles for medical practice and therefore for good medical ethics. And again, Journal of Medical Ethics. So that's a fuller account of what I'm arguing. But in terms of the specific sort of commitments, prima facie commitments that emerge from that, well, in terms of beneficence and non-maleficence, you better know how to do it. If you make a commitment as a doctor, professionals profess to do good things for their clients or their patients, you better know how to do it. So good medical education is a moral commitment, not only for medical students, but also for doctors, to continue to do good medical education throughout their professional lives while they're practicing, so that they can actually do what they claim to do. But so is medical research a commitment. Now, may not necessarily be required of all individuals, but the profession as a whole had better make sure that medical research continues in order to find out how to produce good results for their patients and with as little harm as possible. So beneficence and non-maleficence, as it were, require you to do good education, medical education, and good research, or require the profession to do good research. There may be some division of responsibilities here, but increasingly I think it's recognised that all of us in medicine should be doing an element of research. Now, you can do sort of objective research, find out what states of affairs occur with what sorts of probabilities if you do X or Y or Z, or don't do anything at all. But in order to decide whether they're beneficial or whether they're harmful, you better find out what the people concerned think about the state of affairs. For most of us, if we need a blood transfusion because we're bleeding heavily, it'll be a very good thing and very beneficial if we can have a blood transfusion, please. If we're a Jehovah's Witness, we will say no. We understand that it may save our life, but in our moral perspective, this would be eternal sin, leading to eternal damnation if we accept this intervention. So I want your medical intervention, please. I want you to save my life, but I'm afraid I can't accept blood. For them, it's more harmful to have a blood transfusion than it is to have their lives saved, at least for a lot of them. What actually happens in practice may be different. But, so bear that in mind, that even if you're interested in the old Hippocratic obligation of benefit with minimal harm, still you'll be driven for autonomous patients to respect their autonomy in order to find out what counts as benefit and minimal harm. In the context of respect for autonomy, and I'll whip through this quickly because I see that I'm already wittering on too long, one of the most important concomitants of that is informed consent. If you want to do things to people, you better let them make their own mind up, respect their autonomy, to decide whether they want those things done or not. And that requires you to ask them, and to ask them after having given them adequate information so that they can make an autonomous decision. It also, again, prima facie, requires you to maintain their confidences. Not absolutely, but you in a sense give them a promise that you will treat the information, the very personal and quite often disgusting information that we ask our patients for. Who did you sleep with? Is it a bloke or is it a woman? When did you last have sex? Have you got discharge? What did it look like? Revolting questions that doctors ask their patients. We only do it because we're committed to help them, and answers to those questions very often enable us to help them. But we also tell them that we use this information for their benefit and it's confidential. Otherwise, we use it and we can share it for other people who are there to help. And then there's a big ethical issue about, well, who else can we share it with to help other people in the future? Huge ethical debate about that. And then, of course, in the area of justice, we have these, and all I will say here is a very big problem now, especially with more and more things that we can do, distributive justice. The fair distribution of our scarce resources is a huge and ever-growing problem. But as well as distributive justice, there's also rights-based justice and legal justice, and they all can impinge on medical care. Well, that's a sketch of these four principles and how I think they are an inspiration for us, so far as that respect is equally applicable to everybody potentially affected by our decisions, and finally to do so in ways that are just or fair. Well, I find this pretty inspiring. What about you?